But the biggest issue that I hear time and time again is, how do I integrate strength training into my cycling routine? Why should cyclists strength train?
Well, there's the obvious answer, which is,
do we now have data to verify these assumptions that yes, strength training does in fact increase my FTP?
to be honest, you have to be comfortable prioritizing maintenance, which I find that a lot of people have a hard time doing. But you just put so much damage on your system that you're going to have to recover from, that you could feel for multiple days from those 3 reps. You would never ever get credit for a TSS score from something like that. Like, not even
a
close.
problem with Whoop as well, because I burned 2,700 calories today, but there's no metabolic load of that session on my body.
Did you say you'll burn 1,700 calories in a gym session? You're doing something I don't even know about. The truth is, you have to look at different parts of a program to validate it and to justify it so that it can make sense in their head.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Anthony. I'm a former lawyer turned cyclist turned podcast host who is based in Ireland. My goal with this channel is to introduce you, the viewer, to the people and to the ideas to help you optimize your health, your happiness, and your longevity. I have an exceptional guest joining us today, Mr. Derek Teel. He's the founder of Daunted Health. Today, we're diving deep into the topic that gets a lot of questions, but not enough clarity: strength training for cyclists. We've got 3 big questions we're hoping to get answered today. Why should you, as a cyclist, consider strength training? When should you fit strength training into your already packed cycling schedule? And most importantly, how can you integrate strength training seamlessly without it feeling like an extra burden? Now, before we get started, I do have a small favor to ask. Still around 90% of people watching this channel haven't subscribed. If you can take a second to subscribe, it really helps the channel more than you know. And the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests will get. I promise you that. With all that being said, this is the Roadman Cycling Podcast. And now, my dear friends, it's Derek Teel. Derek, welcome to the Roadman Cycling Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I am totally honored to be here.
Derek, my goal with this conversation is to answer 3 main questions for cyclists as it pertains to strength training. It's why strength training, when should I strength train, and how should I strength train? So we have a big task today. But the biggest issue that I hear time and time again is, how do I integrate strength training into my cycling routine? So I'm excited personally to hear the answer to that. But before we get into the how, let's talk about the why. Why should cyclists strength train?
Well, there's the obvious answer, which is to increase your force production. I think that's the clearest thing that people start strength training and set out to do. They're like, I want to increase my FTP. I want to have more power on the bike. I want to be more explosive. And it's pretty undeniable at this point that strength training benefits just about everything on the bike, with the exception of your VO2 max, really. Even longer efforts have been shown to be improved by strength training. And so that is kind of the obvious one, is just that all-out force production. But there are so many reasons. I feel like that just barely scratches the surface, because when you think about what a good ride is, sure, you had good power, maybe you hit some numbers, but were you comfortable on the bike? Did you feel like you got the most out of your actual body? What does this look like long-term? And I mean, were you riding in pain or without pain? And these are all things that strength training can solve. And I don't know if you want me to go down my quick list, but I'd be happy to get a little bit more into each one of those points.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, I came up in an era with cycling where training was kind of shrouded in a lot of mysticism still. Good riders kept what was working to them protected, like secrets that they passed on to a small subset of friends or training partners. And this was how knowledge was passed down through the years. But do we now have data, and maybe this feeds into your sort of points on why we should strength train, do we now have data to verify these assumptions that yes, strength training does in fact increase my FTP?
There are studies, and we could even link some in the description for your audience. But it's interesting because a lot of times the protocol they use isn't a realistic protocol to use year round. And I think that is one of the big chasms between people who call cycling their number one sport, or even professional athletes who want to integrate strength training, versus maybe the person who is more casual and only rides once or twice a week, because you actually want to ebb and flow your schedule throughout the year. So what you would do at the off season to focus on boosting your FTP when maybe you're base riding or your riding on the bike is a little bit less intense, then you want to actually be able to lower your intensity of strength training more towards a maintenance phase as you increase your volume on the bike and increase the intensity on the bike. There needs to be like an ebb and flow. And that's one thing I've noticed that the science doesn't really support yet, is that there is year-round benefit to strength training. You just have to let the ebb and flow. And to be honest, you have to be comfortable prioritizing maintenance, which I find that a lot of people have a hard time doing. It's like they want that sexy big boost in whatever they're going for, and then they just totally fall off the back for a few months, and they don't know how to just dial it back a little bit and stay consistent.
Yeah, I suppose at this point is a nice segue to parse this conversation and say who we're talking about and who we're not talking about. When I'm asking these questions, I'm not talking about, one of my previous guests, Jay Vine. I'm not talking about that cohort. I'm not talking about World Tour riders who have the logistical difficulty of trying to figure out how to strength train while, navigating 100+ race days a year, grand tours, altitude camps. I'm talking about somebody with, and we can maybe go on and expand on this avatar a little bit later, but I'm talking about somebody who is pretty much a family person, working a job with some conflicting demands on their time that they don't have all day to train.
Thanks for separating that, because I am working hard right now to make sure that my protocols and what I say could be well used for some of the top World Tour athletes. But then also, how do we make that work for the beginner as well? But with that said, the person you just described, let's just say, full-time career, maybe focus there, family, let's just say middle-aged in general. I think that's the biggest demographic that I work with on day to day. So to see what really impacts someone over a year is really interesting, because it's so easy to look at all these studies and all this data and information that we have and build out this perfect training plan. But at the end of the day, what's someone going to do long term and what's realistic? Because if you ask me the question, like, should I strength train, before my ride or after the ride? The question is, if I told you, are you still going to actually do it? You know what I mean? It's like, it's so easy to just make a perfect schedule, but it's like, what is reality for the majority of person? And I think that's when some individuality comes into play, for sure.
That's an amazing point, because we can create these brilliant, beautiful, abstract training plans. But if we talk about that demographic who has conflicting demands on their time, there's different stuff pulling at them, whether it's family commitments, work commitments, social commitments. So when we're building out a training plan, or I'm talking to somebody, even advising them, and we're looking at a macro cycle, like an annual plan, the first thing I'll have them do is like, well, write down the times where, if you're in sales, end of quarter is going to be busy. If you're a family man, coming up to Christmas or around birthdays are going to be busy. Let's highlight these areas and blank them out, because you're not going to be able to peak for an event while simultaneously managing to increase cortisol levels of quarterly sales targets.
Yeah. And training when you're that stressed is so difficult, especially if you see some high intensity interval session. Oh my gosh, coming into that when you're already stressed. I feel like I roll out from, my driveway some days for a ride, and I'm like, I can't even think about having an effort right now, because I just need to breathe. I need to regulate my heart rate. I have 3 kids under 4 right now. I'm running my own business. So there's days I leave and I'm so tense that I just need to woosah a little bit. I need to take a few minutes before I can even think about putting out an effort. And I think that's everything that you mentioned is just so real. And it sucks because there's no data to quantify it necessarily. Like, there's a lot of these things where there aren't these measurable things that you can point to and say, hey, like, this is exactly why I didn't have a great session that day, but this is why it's so important to refer to data, but to also be introspective and to really try and feel your body and think about, why you're performing the way that you are, because it could be something that has to do with your job and not even related to your physical body necessarily. It's more mental.
So with those caveats, what's the top 3 reasons we should be embracing strength training?
Because your time is going to be so valuable spent off the bike, because you can do things off the bike to support your riding that you just cannot do on the bike. So let's give you an example. So let's talk about if you have any pain or discomfort on the bike. Obviously, you got to go get a bike fit. I need to just put out that disclaimer. I'm a huge proponent of bike fits. I think it's a given. I think it's one of the best uses of your money. If it's between a higher level spec on a new bike and no bike fit versus a lower level spec plus bike fit, go lower level, get a bike fit. I think that's probably going to be more beneficial. Now, with that being said, you could have a perfect fit on your bike and still be super uncomfortable because of your actual body itself. If you have muscle compensations, like let's just say, for example, your lower back is getting fired up and it's compensating for what your core should be doing. Essentially, it's trying to stabilize and work on overdrive because your abs are so inactive, or you have no ab engagement at all. Maybe you don't have any glute engagement. These are all the muscles that should be firing to protect your low back. But instead, your low back is taking the heat of that, and you end your ride completely smoked, or you can't finish an effort because of that pain. Now, how would you correct that on the bike? You really can't do it. You have to actually get off of the bike and put yourself in positions like, for example, to get your low abs activated, you could do a posterior tilt exercise. You could do hip hinges to get your glutes activated. And you could hold planks and breathe while you have core tension to train your body to do this so that when you go out on the bike, those muscles are actually firing. Like it's almost impossible to do because of the poor position of the bike. As much as I love cycling, it's just, you can't argue that it's like this healthy position that, you know, is going to solve all your problems.
Yeah, I'm already feeling attacked here. Like I'm 4 hours into a ride and I could just feel my lower back, like those erector spinae stabilizing muscles either side of the spine, just locking tight on me. And I know it's like neglect in core. So it's you just validating that assumption for me now.
Oh, yeah. And a lot of times it's your QL as well. Like when people have single-sided back pain, you have this deeper muscle, your quadratus lumborum, and there's a stretch you can do to alleviate it, but to do it on the bike is so difficult. And not only that, but you have to, when you're strength training, part of the reason it's so effective is because you're in a safe, controlled space. There's a lot of things you can't do on the bike simply because you have to stabilize and make sure that you don't crash, and it's not necessarily safe. So if you're trying to do all your stretching on the bike, which some stretching on the bike can be helpful throughout a ride, but it's just not going to be the same as if you're sitting on the floor. For example, if you were to stretch your QL in your back, you could do a seated position, wide legs, like you would do a hamstring stretch, but you would reach with your opposite arm toward the foot. And reaching with the opposite arm pushes that stretch into your low back, right where you're probably going to feel that pain. But again, if you're trying to stabilize on the bike, it's not going to work just by kind of arching out. So you have to breathe, allow your body to sit into the stretch, and then you can start focusing on letting that muscle, in particular, the release. So that's why off the bike strength training is so important, because you can do things that just cannot be done on the bike that are completely necessary for you to have your best ride. And honestly, that's just pain coming from muscle compensations. That doesn't even have to do with your overall economy and your overall cycling efficiency. Because if you have, let's just say you have quads that are compensating for your hamstrings because your hamstrings are just completely dormant. They're not firing. They're not doing any supporting work. Now, it's obvious that quads are the primary knee extender, so they're going to be doing the majority of the work in the pedal stroke. But if you don't have your hamstrings supporting them a little bit and working a little bit, you're not going to be getting as much out of your legs as you should be. In fact, that muscle mass, which especially road cyclists are so concerned about putting on too much muscle, if you want to get the most out of the current muscle that you have, you can't have compensations in your body. So how do you get more hamstring activation? Well, you could do all sorts of stuff like scrape the gum off your shoe at the bottom of a pedal stroke. And there are those things, or you can train it in a very controlled place like the gym, where you put yourselves in positions where it's almost impossible for your hamstrings not to be the primary mover. You get them activated, you get them stronger. And then when you go out on the bike, it's autonomous. You don't have to think about it. You know, your brain and your body just does it and it works together. So not only do you have less pain, but you're more efficient with the actual available muscle that you have.
I'm back in the gym for the last 4 weeks since I had Joe Friel on the podcast, because my next birthday is one of those milestone birthdays of 40, and not looking forward to it. But Joe Friel had me freaked out, so I'm back in the gym. But something I've really enjoyed about being back at the gym is the idea of it being a counterpoint to cycling. And let me expand on that. I had a guest on the podcast, Colin O'Brady, a while back. Fascinating guy, and he was the first guy to ever row solo across Drake Passage. So he painted me this amazing picture of rowing across Drake Passage in the worst storm you've ever seen, and he has to get into this like little crawl space beneath the deck where he's shitting himself, he's puking for 24 hours, and it's effectively a condensed coffin with no food, violently seasick. And the storm eventually subsided, and he came out of there, not sure whether he was going to live or die at points. And he came out and he looked across the calm bay, and he said it's the most beautiful calm bay he's ever seen in his life. And at that moment, he realized that he needed the storm and the depths of despair in that storm to appreciate the true beauty of the calm sea. I feel like obviously a dialed down version of that for me going from the bike to the gym. I love riding the bike, but some days, and I'm lucky enough to have a schedule that's quite flexible, it allows me to ride my bike almost every day. But some days I'll go out on the bike and it feels laborious. It feels like drudgery, monotony. And I'm like, oh, I'm so blessed to be out on the bike. Why don't I feel blessed to be out on the bike? But the gym has given me that back, and it's energized that, because now I don't ride the bike every single day. So when I do ride the bike, I have that feeling of blessed again on the bike, as corny as it sounds.
Oh, it doesn't sound corny at all. I think that your long-term ability to stay consistent is so much greater when you add strength training in for those reasons. It keeps things fresh, and it allows you to do something physical that still supports what you want on the bike. In fact, makes it better. And it's funny because this is one of those, like, I could never have science to tell you that you'd be more consistent cycling by strength training, but based off my personal experience, off the thousands of people I've trained that are in that demographic that we've talked about, of people who are pressed for time, you have other higher priorities besides your bike as much as you love it. Adding that strength training keeps things fresh because, dude, I ride multiple disciplines: road, gravel, mountain. I got a great turbo setup, and I love it. Riding my bike is my favorite thing to do. It's been my favorite thing since I was 12 years old. But still, there are days I wake up and I don't really feel like riding my bike. And I think that's totally okay. So, and I ride 4 to 5 days without fail every single week. But those other days are typically when I'm strength training. And it is just so refreshing. And again, you do things you can't do on the bike that support it. So it's such a win-win. And for the people who want to integrate strength training, but they do have all these time-pressing schedule demands, and they realize, oh man, maybe I am pushing the limit of my training time at the moment, and I need to back off a little ride volume to get this strength workout in, I totally recommend it, because even you cutting an hour out on the bike per week, and I'm sorry to even digress this conversation a little bit, but I want to make this point. Even if you were to cut 60 minutes out total of your riding volume per week, and you dedicated that to 2 30-minute strength training sessions spread throughout the week, I would be shocked if you did not feel significantly better, opposed to just doing a little bit more of the same. So to get off, to add the mobility, to add the strength work, it is well worth that time spent. And I don't know what you would, if you would agree with that or not. You could tell me based off your experience, but
yeah,
that's my thought.
I would fully agree with that. I think it's a nice segue into when do we strength train? Like, how do we periodize strength training around our bike workouts? So in the coaching company behind the podcast, we coach at the moment, I'd say roughly 100 plus clients. So I'll break down a typical week for most of those clients. Obviously, everyone's going to be in the comments if they're watching this on YouTube, like, oh, this isn't my schedule, but freestyle it yourselves if it's not your schedule. Monday, we see a lot of clients taking off. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, there's sessions getting performed, but they're quite time crunched, 60 to 90 minutes max, maybe before work, maybe later in the evening, or someone squeezing in at lunch. Friday, it's either a light day, active recovery, like a 30 minutes on one ride, or else off. And then the bulk of the duration is done at the weekend. This is, I'm breaking down a typical base period, off-season period. Maybe if it's in the season, there's a midweek criterium or a weekend race thrown in there. But so how do we structure strength training around that sort of work on a micro level? And then I suppose zooming out on a macro level, does that change based on if we're in base period, build period, or heading into a more race intensive period?
Awesome questions. So that is a typical schedule that I see quite a bit. And I see on those more time crunch sessions throughout the week, some intensity still in there. And typically someone has, like, if they're training Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it's like intensity Tuesday, more of a zone 2 ride Wednesday, and then some intensity Thursday before recovery, your day off Friday. So yeah, I figured, give or take. Okay. So the difference in the seasons, I'll tell you the intensity difference, but then we'll go into the specifics of which day you would do your strength training on. So the biggest difference between in season versus out of season with your strength training is the intensity. The volume ideally would get higher during the off season, or this would be most people's base training season. but it's the intensity. Like you really don't want to carry fatigue and soreness during the season into a fast group ride that's like your local race ride every Saturday morning. And maybe you tack on a volume. Maybe it's a 4-hour day with intensity. You come home drained. If you go into that fatigued, it's going to really suck. But if it's the base season and you have 4 hours of zone 2, you can come into it with a little fatigue and a little soreness, and you know it's for the greater good, and there's nothing really riding on it. It's January. Everyone's looking at each other and wanting to stop for coffee anyways. So enjoy that time to actually increase the intensity and potentially the volume of your strength training sessions during the off season. So when you get into the season, the biggest difference is not the training frequency. Like I want everyone training 2 days per week minimum, but you dial back the intensity, even if it's to the base phase activation where ultimately you leave a session feeling better than when you started. That's how a lot of the sessions should feel throughout the season. If you're just working on maintenance, you shouldn't really be beat down too much. And so does that give you a clear idea of the difference between base and season?
Yeah, I like that. It explains it well. And also, I suppose when you get into the season, you have the benefit of those historic workouts for the past few months. So you're not going to be, when you dial back that intensity, you're not going to be carrying those DOMs into your more intense, chain gang or crits to weekend.
Totally. And what I think people forget, and this is the part of strength training for cyclists right now that's not being executed well by the majority. It's not whether or not you should strength train. I think most people do agree that you should, but they still will put you on this strength training program that does carry fatigue into your ride. So it doesn't really feel reasonable to do when your intensity on the bike comes up in spring, let's just say. So they just say, okay, now you're done strength training. Off season's over. You're done. It's all on the bike work. And maybe keep stretching, maybe use a foam roll every once in a while. But it's this huge on or off switch. And what you just said is so correct. You built these gains of strength through the off season that you want to carry into the season, but you have to dial it back or those gains will go away quickly, way faster than you got them, unfortunately. And so you just want to dial that back a little bit and keep the training frequency the same. So let's just say, for instance, your rate of perceived exertion during the off season strength training sessions is like an 8 or a 9. You could dial it back to like 5 to 7, 5 to 6 during the season, still stay activated and actually maintain your strength throughout the majority of the season. Maybe if you have an open month, you can increase the weight really quickly mid-season and really maintain. But the thing is, if you don't just dial it back and keep going, you're just going to lose those gains. Like probably by the time you get to your A race, you'll probably have lost that strength gains. Like,
and the beautiful thing with dialing it back is, because during the season, because you're racing multiple disciplines, like you're going to the well quite often, like that well of motivation where you're digging deep in races. And that willpower is not an indefinite resource. Like you can only go to the well so many times during a week. And if you're doing a chain gang on a Tuesday night, a crit on a Thursday night, and a race again on a Saturday or Sunday, it's like that willpower to go hard is exhausted. So the thoughts of going into the gym on a Friday and pushing an 8 or 9 rate of perceived exertion session, it's just not that mentally appealing. But when you can dial that back to a 5, all of a sudden it feels like that counterpoint we were talking about, like a reprieve.
Yeah, and I'm happy you used Friday as an example because that was the day I was going to suggest for one of your strength training sessions. Now, if we look at that week that you had mentioned, and this is really in season or out of season, but for that example, I think leaving Monday as your rest day is probably a great idea because the weekend you had the majority of your volume. I think that's great. Now, let's just say you're someone who does a 60 to 90 minute indoor session on Tuesday. That could be a great day, if possible, to also add in a strength training session because now you have a 2-day split between your strength training if it's on Tuesday and then Friday. You have the rate of perceived exertion lower. And let's just say, for example, that person on the Wednesday is doing a zone 2 ride. They can come into that with a little fatigue anyways. And then by the time they get to their Thursday ride, maybe they have some more intensity indoor on the turbo. They have their strength training day Friday, and then they can get into their weekend and then recover Monday. I think that would probably be an ideal schedule because really spacing it out as much as possible is what you want to do. And I think most coaches agree. It's like spreading out the intensity with the exception of certain points throughout the year. You have to get that progressive overload in blocks. But to space it out throughout the week as much as possible is the best way to stay consistent and just to recover between sessions. But I will say,
when's fatigue going to be
Good.
at its maximum on a session? So, like if I do a strength session on Tuesday morning and it's quite a heavy, intense strength session, say an 8 or 9 rate of perceived exertion, is my fatigue from that session, is that going to be at its maximum on Tuesday evening, on Wednesday, or on Thursday? Because I know some of us experience this delayed muscle soreness.
Yeah, it's a good question. DOMS. If you guys haven't felt DOMS, you probably haven't had like a crazy lower body split day where you're doing Bulgarian split squats and trap bar deadlifts and step ups and every variation of a leg workout, which I don't recommend doing, by the way, for a cyclist. But DOMs are crazy because you can do a strength training session and not feel sore until 48 hours after the session, and it just hits you so bad that you can barely sit on and off the toilet. I mean, that is how real DOMs can be. And it's really hard to say when someone's going to feel the most fatigue from strength training, because it really is one of those things that's so individual based off of recovery. Because it's like, what was your nutrition like pre and post session? How was your hydration? How was your sleep? Did you lay down and elevate your legs for 15 minutes after your strength session? Or did you work on your feet for 8 hours directly after? You know what I mean? So it's very hard to say when that would be, but it really could be anywhere within, 72 hours, technically. You could feel the most fatigue from it. But I think that's where being consistent enough to understand your body and actually taking a moment to ask yourself how you feel is important, because you'll continue to make better decisions based on intensity and almost self-regulate it the more experienced you get with strength training. Because, for all the people who are super data driven, which I am too, I love it, on the bike, power, all the metrics, you don't get good TSS scores from strength training. They almost pretty much don't exist.
It's an age-old problem. Like, how do you quantify your strength training session into? I used to just divide it by half. Like, I'd say if an hour full gas on the road is going to be 100 stress points. If I go an hour pretty much full gas in the gym, I'm going to give it 50 stress points. But even that's different because of the way the CTL is calculated, and fatigue has to drive CTL. It's not fatiguing at the same rate. Like, there's not a linear relationship between fatigue and fitness when you're in the gym. So it's an age-old question. I don't have the answer to it.
Yeah, and I think that you could go crazy trying to quantify it. So I think adding it to training stress isn't the best idea. Like, I don't typically recommend that, to have someone see it lumped in with their cycling. I think if you could give yourself RPE scores and almost have it as a separate tally and just refer to one or another, I think that is honestly ideal, because otherwise it's too confusing. Because just to give you guys an example, if you wore a heart rate monitor through your strength training session and you did, let's just say, a heavy set of 3 deadlifts on a trap bar, this is going to be one of the heaviest exercises you're probably physically capable of doing that uses your total body. Well, for a trained cyclist, I doubt you're going to get your heart rate out of zone 2. But you just put so much damage on your system that you're going to have to recover from, that you could feel for multiple days from those 3 reps, that you would never, ever get credit for a TSS score from something like that. Like, not even
even
close.
A problem with Whoop as well, because I started using Whoop again now, and other wearables like Aura I've tried out. But a lot of it is largely driven off your heart rate. So your calorie burn is also calculated off your heart rate on it. So you can have a day where you go to the gym, and I look at it, I'll be like, whoa, I only burned 1,700 calories today, even though I was in the gym, and I feel toast after the workout. Versus if I go out and do like a 90-minute coffee shop ride, it's like, hey, I burned 2,700 calories today, but there's no metabolic load of that session on my body.
Did you say you'll burn 1,700 calories in a gym session?
No, like total across the day. Oh,
total. I was like, dude, you're doing something I don't even know about, if that's the case. Because it's true. I'll have a hard 1 hour strength workout, like something I would give a RPE of 8, that I'm definitely going to be carrying fatigue for the next couple of days, or at least the next day. And yeah, I'm looking at my calorie burn from tracking. It's like 350, maybe 400. So, but then again, it's that real fatigue. And then it does different things to your metabolism too, and your muscle, the amount of muscle repair that needs to happen. It's just a different energy system. It's a different toll on your body. And so to kind of separate it, I think is good if you're someone who really wants to track that info. But I think the biggest rule of thumb is to just really dial up and down the intensity throughout the season, opposed to just stopping.
Today's show is sponsored by The Breakaway. A few years ago, I saw a huge gap in the market for an app that was like a cycling coach in your pocket. I knew AI was ultimately going to be the best coach in the world. I spent about 2 years of my life trying to build this, but unfortunately it didn't happen. Ever since then, I've kept a really close eye on the AI space to see if anyone else could succeed where I failed. The Breakaway app caught my attention a couple of months back because Christian Vande Velde, yep, the same Christian Vande Velde who got fourth in the Tour de France, is one of the co-founders for The Breakaway. And it seems that at The Breakaway, they've created the ultimate cycling training companion, and they're bringing low-cost coaching to the masses. You'll know from listening to my podcast that my pet peeve is when cyclists head out the door with no plan, no goal, and just roll around with no objective. Please don't be that guy, I implore you. The Breakaway app looks at all your historic training data and it builds training plans around your strengths and weaknesses, so you always have the perfect training session. They also have integrations which I'm really excited about. Whoop and Oura Ring. The reason I previously ditched my wearables was because the data didn't really inform my training. Well, now it does. You can head on over to roadmantrial.com and you can get a free 30-day trial for the app. The link for this is in the description down below.
And that also kind of brings me to the point that people really should be strength training 2 days per week, even to maintain throughout the season, even though based off of super compensation, which is like the recovery curve, 1 day a week should be sufficient for maintenance. But in my experience, it just isn't. It just is not sufficient for true maintenance. And you don't feel as good when you don't get your system activated at least 2 days per week. Like the frequency doesn't seem to be high enough for myself personally, but also for people that I train. And also, you're not going to get the most, even if you're coming into a race day. Sorry, I'm going on a tangent here, but I was just working on my athlete's calendar. I trained one pro athlete as a sponsored athlete of Dialed Health. And right now, like on his calendar, he's racing this Saturday. So we have a strength session on total body strength session on Tuesday. It's a RPE of like a 5. It's all bands. It's pretty complex and there's a lot of stability, but it's just all bands. And then on Friday, on his openers day, when he'll just go out on the bike, do a few openers, he's also going to do a pre-ride activation, which, I mean, by my books is strength training. It's not progressive overload, but you're still holding a plank. You're still doing some stability movements. And it's like a 10-minute routine, but he's going to do that before his openers and he will feel his best on race day, opposed to just even strength training on the Tuesday and then not doing any of that until his race on Saturday. Having that little touch just to wake up and activate your body, it's a game changer.
So that's for somebody that's 2 days a week strength training. We're looking at a Tuesday, Friday split. But if you take somebody who has maybe a little bit more available free time and or is super motivated, like a typical Cat 1 racer, and they're looking to strength train 3 days a week, what days would you advise them hitting the gym on with the same schedule?
I would tell them not to do it.
Really?
I would tell them to stick to 2 days a week. I would say if they can handle more intensity during those 2 strength training days, do it, and then save everything else for the bike. If they're at that level, but if there's somebody who, let's just say they're a cat 5, they're cat 3, and also they let's just say they also have the goal of, I want to put a little bit of meat on my arms. Which is, by the way, for everyone listening, I just want to say it's totally okay to have goals that are not cycling related. Like if you say, hey, cycling is my favorite thing. I want to feel good on the bike, but also like I want a little bit of a chest and shoulders. Like I want to feel a little stronger. You know, I ride 3 days per week. That's the type of person that really should do or consider like a 3-day a week strength training schedule. But if you're somebody who's racing as competitively as Cat 1 and you have extra free time to train, likely they need to spend that time on mobility, or they should just push it back into their on the bike training. You know, as much as I want to say strength training is always the answer, more like there's a point where more is not going to benefit those higher level athletes. They're just, it's true.
So for the other cohort that you mentioned that are looking to put a bit more meat on their bones for whatever reason, they want to be in the gym 3 days a week and they're looking to figure out what day is best. What are you saying to them?
Yeah, I think 3 days a week is a really good idea. I think that this is the person now that can add the intensity to their sessions, and maybe they don't feel the need, like for them carrying a little fatigue into a ride might be okay, which opens up a lot of possibilities. Now, this is also a person too that could just say, hey, I love riding, but not that much. Like, I don't want to ride that frequently. And I really love my time in the gym. So that is a person that I would recommend getting at least 2 total body strength training days in per week. But that third day might be a more focused on upper body day, especially for the person that wants to, like, I'm saying this example because I actually get this a lot of a lot of people saying, hey, I want to, be able to do 10 pull-ups, or I want to be able to do 50 push-ups without stopping, like I used to when I was going through the police academy or something like that. Random example, but like, these are all the things I talk to people about. So that's when it's like, okay, cool. Let's go to the gym. I'm still going to have you do some mobility, but this is going to be primarily upper body. And so for you to sprinkle that into your schedule, now maybe you do your Tuesday total body session, and then the next day on Wednesday, you follow it up with an upper body focused session. You still have some total body mobility, and then you have your total body session again on the Friday.
Okay, I like that split. And is there a good day if you're looking at your weekly schedule and you're looking to do a double day? And just to clarify, double day, I mean in gym and biking in the same day. Would you recommend doing the gym and bike on the same day on a day it's an endurance ride or a more interval focused ride?
I love this question because I've been changing my mind about this a little bit. And it sounds funny because you think, oh, just point to the science. What do you need to change your mind? But there really isn't like much to point to. So you have to go off of your own experience. You have to go off your coaching experience with your clients. And there's positives and negatives to both. But I'll tell you that I used to lean toward adding your strength training to your easier day on the bike, because if you have a high intensity strength training session combined with a hard interval session, you might actually dig yourself so deep in a hole that it's going to take more than just a zone 2 ride the next day to even recover out of that. And it could actually be damaging. Like, it gets to a point where, oh, it's going to be too hard. But I also had realized just through some experience that most people aren't doing 2 hours of sweet spot intervals followed by a strength training session that is 8 or 9 perceived exertion. And for that person, they should just back off their strength training intensity that day if they're going to do 2 hours of, let's just say, sweet spot intervals. So that was the conflict I had, was like, by adding strength training to an already intense day, is that just going to be too much and you dig yourself too deep?
And I think there's also a mental component to that as well, because we're just kind of saying intense rather than breaking that down. Because intense can mean, like, are you going out and doing 10 kilo efforts? Are you going out and doing 4x4 minute VO2 max efforts? For me, they're quite a manageable effort because they're short. And it's going to suck, but it's only 4 minutes. But if I was to be in the gym in the morning with a very heavy gym session, and then you were saying to me, it's 2x25 or 3x20 threshold, that's an hour of hard work. An hour of hard work on sore legs does not feel very appetizing at all.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I've realized just through some more experience, to be honest, is that most people aren't doing really high volume rides with a lot of intensity in the middle of the week. And so let's just say you do have a VO2 effort. They're short, they're 4 minutes, you're doing 5 of them, and the whole total session is an hour long. Then it becomes very manageable to say that you'll add a strength training session to that. You'll probably feel great. And then the next day you can go on a zone 2 ride and actually get the benefit from it. Maybe you carry a little fatigue, but again, it's zone 2, it's okay. And then probably by that following day, you're recovered. So I am leaning more toward that. But I think there is a place for some people, depending on schedule and overall ride intensity, that could stack a strength training session on an endurance day. But again, it just makes less and less sense the more people I talk to, just because the reality of the duration of an intense session is typically shorter, especially throughout the week. So I would stack it on that day. Did that answer it clearly enough for you?
Yeah, no, perfect. And I love the structure of this conversation, because we've kind of covered the why strength train, we've covered the when to strength train. Now I think how, and this is the most daunting part for a lot of us, because we're so comfortable wearing clothes that are basically as revealing as body paint and sitting in a coffee shop with our friends, but somehow we feel foreign and self-conscious as soon as we walk into the gym. So this part is going to be very valuable for people. To start out, like, what's our starting point? Like, and let me anchor that with the equivalent starting point for when a client comes into me for coaching. I want to know two things, just like maybe your Garmin GPS wants to know when you get into the car. Where are you right now? That's my baseline testing. And where do you want to go? Your destination or your goal. Once we have those two and we know their schedule, then we can start to plot that journey.
Mm-hmm.
How do you baseline test? How do you figure out where they are now in the strength and conditioning world?
That's a really good question. And actually something I'm still trying to figure out, because I don't have any baseline protocols for a test for specific strength training at this point, because the goal through my product has always been to improve your experience on the bike. So I always just lean back on where someone is at on the bike technically. Or we can do actual physical body measurements for people who want to lose body fat. You know, as a personal trainer and all the time I spent in the general fitness industry, body composition change was a very big part of it. So a lot of the testing looks back at their FTP and their ride performance, or it looks at their actual body composition. Because if you're somebody that comes to me and says, I want to put on, let's just say 50 pounds on my back squat, that's great. But what I'm going to do to get you there versus to get you on the bike is and going as fast as you can and having the best experience, it's wildly different.
Yeah.
And so I've had a hard time trying to come up with these protocols of being like, oh, what are these baseline metrics people should hit? And I'm still honestly trying to work out on it. And I think a lot of it would come down to some calisthenics. But again, if you're somebody who wants to get better at pull-ups, you need to do pull-ups twice a week. These are people I talk to who I'm like, hey, here's your base program, but also you're going to add pull-ups this day because you have that specific goal. Because your goal is to be generally improve your health and well-being and your performance on the bike. We look at body composition and then we look at your actual performance on the bike. And then what you do in the gym is more of a byproduct of that, if that makes sense. So the standards to get started aren't necessarily set for you to have like an improvement. Like, let's just say, like, I don't have like a percentage baseline for reps, for example. It's not like a normal powerlifting routine where you get your 1 rep max and then you say, okay, these days you do 65% of that and you work off it like a FTP would. I've never found that to be beneficial, to be honest. And I think that's why it's so frustrating to have good strength training for people, because they want it so quantifiable. But the truth is, you have to look at different parts of a program to validate it and to justify it so that it can make sense in their head. Like, for example, someone who is their priority is performance on the bike and overall health and well-being. They need to decide in their head, okay, I'm going to get started with strength training, and it's going to be 2 days per week because that is the actual minimum to make any sort of progress based off of super compensation. As I mentioned earlier, I believe with regressed intensity levels, you should do it even for maintenance, but 2 days per week minimum if I want to actually make progress. And if you guys want to look up the super compensation curve, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. It's basically your baseline performance. You do a training session, your performance drops because you're recovering. And as you recover beyond your initial level of performance, that's when you want to hit your next session and have this like hopeful stair step progression. But you can look that up and see what I'm talking about. So that's what you need to commit to in your head. Okay, I'm going to strength train 2 days per week. Now, from there, you have to commit to strength training total body. And this is when you ask yourself, what's the best use of my time and how do I have a balanced program? And what I learned through my training at Equinox, which is a gym chain across the world, is that you want to focus on the 7 effective movements to have a balanced training schedule. And so those are like the 2 things I start most of my programs with, unless there is a higher frequency of the program. So for 2 days a week, I'm like, okay, at the minimum, I need to have a hip dominant movement, like a squat or a deadlift. I need to have a knee dominant movement, like a lunge or a step up. I need to have a core movement, ideally with some sort of rotation. And then I need to have a horizontal push, a horizontal pull. So that'd be like a row or a push up. And then I need to have a vertical push and a vertical pull. That'd be like a shoulder press or a pull up. I need to have some variety of those, and at least once a week. And that way I'll know I have a base of a well-rounded schedule. Now from there, you can get more specific based off of equipment. So like the next question would be, what equipment do you have available? And for a lot of people, they're not even willing to go to the gym for those reasons that you mentioned, or it's because truthfully, cyclists spend so much time on the bike that they don't want the time it takes to go to the gym. Like even if you don't have issues with how comfortable you are working out in front of people, it could be just literally time, or I want to step out in my garage, or hey, you know, this is the only way I'm going to get it done. I have one kettlebell, or I have a bench and a set of adjustable dumbbells. Then you have to go off of that. So what's interesting that, you know, this is a kind of a trainer to trainer note that you'll probably understand, is that a lot of programs I've built recently have been to accommodate for people's equipment access based off of those guidelines, not just like pure performance. Like I'm like this type of rider and I have access to all the equipment. I'm willing to do whatever you want. It's like, I have bands and dumbbells. What do
And
you
they're the
got for me,
best
Derek?
programs to build. They're the funnest ones. Like I've trained guys for haute route events, but they live in Qatar and Doha, literally the flattest place on earth. So it's like, how do you get someone ready for that? They're challenges that are just, they get you thinking creatively.
It's very true. I think some of the most satisfying programs I've made have been the limited equipment programs, because you have to get creative. And there's things like, if you have a bodyweight program, it's like, how do you train your back? You know, usually training your back requires a lot of pulling motions and external load, but there's ways to do it. And is it always perfect? No. I think the more tools you have at your availability, you know, the higher chance you'll have of variety and, you know, getting the optimal program. But the truth is, what's optimal is the thing that people are gonna do for the most part. I mean, you could run with that a lot of ways, like, you know, don't just do 1,000 burpees because you think that's like good strength training. But, you know, it's like, I want people to be consistent and get started. And if it means that they have a foam roller and that's it for now, then like, let's get them rolling. And one thing I'll note about the gym, by the way, about being comfortable in the gym, I've trained in gyms with like, okay, Santa Monica Equinox, for example. This is where most of the fitness influencers that you see on Instagram train. They are beautiful. They have the most insane bodies, whether they're mostly plastic and roided up or not, they're insane. But you know what? Those people either are actually super encouraging and nice to talk to because they've been in gym culture for very long, and they applaud people for getting after it. They just want to see people training, or they're so obsessed with themselves that they don't even see you. I'm just telling you, that is the truth. No one is like gonna look over at you and laugh because you don't know how to do a good squat. Like, people want to help. And that's been my experience like throughout all of my gym training as a personal trainer.
And I always flick it to like my point of view. If I see somebody who's carrying some extra weight and they don't look like they belong on a bike, if I see them cycling, my attitude is never, oh, who do they think they are cycling? My attitude is, oh my God, that's amazing. They're taking the first step. They've got out of their comfort zone. Like, who knows where this journey is going to end up? Like, my journey with cycling is largely defined. My ceiling has been set, and it's figuring out new challenges. But for them, embarking on that journey, the ceiling hasn't been set, and it's such a fun, exciting time. And for anyone getting into the gym, your ceiling hasn't been set. If you're just getting in, it could go anywhere. It could be the next Mr. Olympia.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think if you're someone who wants to get in the gym and has that barrier, ask trainers for questions. You know, there's floor trainers who literally, I'm cleaning, you know, you start at a gym, you don't have clientele. I know how to train people, and I'm just cleaning the gym, and I want to help somebody, but also I don't want to just come off too salesy. It's hard to approach. There's like a very fine line. So if you see a floor trainer walking around, you say, hey, I don't know how to use this machine, or hey, can you look at my deadlift form? Hey, can you, you know, like, I'm curious, what weight should I use on the shoulder press? They'd probably be happy to help you. Or even that super experienced looking person in the gym, you just say, hey, you look super experienced. Can you help me with this? That would make their freaking day. So kind of a random tangent, but I promise you guys, that is the truth of the mindset in the gym. If you experience something different, that is like a very weird, that's like a fringe minority. And also, if they're under like 18 and they're just working out with the football team, you can leave them alone. They're kind of in a different class too. So, you know.
And do your protocols change as somebody ages?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, you know, gender, age, it really comes down to someone's training ability and their training experience and like their training age. But I always tell people, the older they are, to take it slower, and take it slower when they start, and to potentially allow themselves for more recovery time. You know, it's interesting because you don't want to assume that someone's less fit just because they're 60. Like, there's 60-year-olds I train who are so much fitter than the 30-year-olds that I train.
I ride with an 84-year-old the weekend that he put away most Cat 2, Cat 3 guys around the world.
That's sick. That's sick. So that's the thing, is you have to respect the reality that, okay, there's going to be longer recovery time. But also, this person could have a lot more training experience. They could be a lot smarter. They could eat better. They could actually get good sleep and stretch. Like, there's a lot of things they could be doing that this young gun, who could be on the brink of an injury just because he's just, hammering training and also hammering beers every night. Like, you don't know where someone's at. So I think that I typically am more cautious with people as they age. But once I know that their training ability, the protocol is pretty much the same.
I always say to clients that training gives us the possibility to get stronger, to get faster. And that possibility is realized when we adequately recover. When I'm leaving the gym, I always see the kind of gym bro culture is straight into a protein shake straight away. Do you have a protocol that you recommend to your clients for when they're finishing up in the gym?
I always tell them to stretch. And I know we can lean into the nutrition more so, but there's this weird trend of people saying that stretching doesn't work. I don't know why. It's usually a lot of people who spend time, 5 days a week in the gym, who are doing super deep range of motion on every exercise. Like, this is a total can that we don't need to go into, but I would just say I recommend stretching at the end of your session, unless you have this dedicated habit of doing it every single night before bed. But I always tell people to do it because typically they'll say, oh, I'll stretch at home. And they just always forget about it. So if you're truthfully that person that doesn't forget, like, my nighttime routine is I sit down, I put my earphones in, I watch Roadman Cycling Podcast. I use a percussion massage gun, and it's just super relaxing. And then I do a few stretches, and that's like my wind down after my kids, or at least my twins, have gone to sleep. And so I know that if I don't finish the strength training session with a stretch, it's because I really don't feel like I need it, and I know I'm going to do it later. But I also know that I'm going to do it later. If there's at some point, if you do this heavy contraction, give yourself the benefit of doing the opposite and like relieve some of that tension. And also kickstart some of your recovery, because you holding a static stretch is shown to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, which just helps your body recover a little bit faster. So I would just say, finish your session with a stretch, breathe, and then the sooner you can get in nutrition, the better. I mean, I think staying super well hydrated is ideal. Making sure that you have 40 grams of protein within 30 minutes. It's not completely essential, because your daily nutrition should be very like spread out. So for instance, like, if you finish a session feeling hungry and depleted, you should get food in fast, carbs and protein. If you finish a session and you're well hydrated and you don't feel hungry, to wait an hour and a half to your next meal isn't a big deal. And you cramming a bunch of protein in just after your session isn't going to make up for not having protein that morning or later in that evening. So this is one of those things. It's like long-term consistency. Like, timing is important, but it's like the next level of things you should be concerned about. But I will say on that note, for just recovery and supplementation, everyone having a good protein powder, I think, is a great idea. It's very easy to use. Most people, when they track their food, realize they're not eating enough protein. And so I think that's a great idea for people. And it's also like, it's some good variety. I have a chocolate protein powder that I'll have for dessert some nights. I just mix it up with some almond milk or some oat milk, and it turns into like a pudding, and I'll scoop it up with like graham crackers or something. Amazing. And so you can do little things like that you don't just always want to eat more chicken or whatever high protein source you're going to, egg whites. And I also recommend creatine for cyclists, which is kind of a debated topic, but I have a video on my YouTube channel actually about why cyclists should take creatine.
5 grams?
But I think that's I think 5 grams a day, unless you're under like 120 pounds. I don't know how many kilos that would be. That'd be like 55 kilos or something like that.
It's light.
If you're less than that, maybe 3 grams. But at 5 grams a day will probably ward off any of the side effects, and there's very few. But if you load it and start taking like 30 grams a day like they used to back in the day, you could get a little gut distress, but that's when you really carry a lot more water. But just remember, the water goes into your muscle. It doesn't go into your subcutaneous fat. You know, if you look puffy, it's not from creatine. You should look more muscular. But yeah, I recommend creatine.
Derek, this was a super, super valuable chat. I'm going to link up your website, Dialed Health, and if you send me a link to that YouTube video on creatine, I'll link that up as well, and any other resource we talked about today. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
Thank you so much. It's honestly awesome to be here. Before you reached out, I was watching the Jay Vine interview, so I'm a huge fan of what you do. And I hope anyone who has more questions with strength training feels free to reach out. You guys can go through my website, dialedhealth.com, get signed up, less than $20 a month. And hopefully everything I just mentioned will be written out nicely for you and you can just put it into practice.
Derek, thank you very much. If you enjoyed that episode, please press here for another conversation that I know you're going to love. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your club mates.